The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peg Mello. I work for the library. We're here to welcome David Pietrusza to our noon book author event. He's an award-winning author and presidential historian and is here to discuss his book, Roosevelt Sweeps Nation, FDR's 1936 Landslide and the Triumph of the Liberal Ideal. Welcome.
Thank you, Peg. One of the questions I often get is, why did you write this book? And well, I've written a bunch of these presidential election histories, chronicles, and starting with 1920. And 1920 was like 1936, which is why they're asking why 1936, a big blowout. Drama. What's the story here? It's like one sentence and that's it. Now the one sentence in 1920 was Harding wins, and it's like, Harding? You wrote a big book about Harding? And it's like, well, there are other people involved. There are other incidents. There are backstories. There's why you end up with a Harding or a Roosevelt again, or why you might not. Why you might not, because while the headline, which we remember in all the textbooks, is that the polls got it so very wrong. Now, they don't do that ever again. No, they don't do that. It's all scientific. And this is the year when the scientific polling really gains great currency. But before that, the big dog in the polling industry was the Literary Digest. And the Literary Digest would, just basically be a news magazine, and they would report what all the newspapers were doing, or magazines, and, what they thought about what was. They were pretty well respected. So well respected that in 1932, Josephus Daniels, who was the boss of Franklin Roosevelt in the Navy Department in World War I, he had a newspaper in North Carolina. And full disclosure, I used to work for the Daniels family, okay, with Total Sports Publishing. But anyway, he says, let's just cancel this election and say, and get a copy of the Literary Digest, and we'll know who won, because they had picked, which was a very close eyelash election, all the way through 1924, when they pick every state except Kentucky as which way it's going to go, and they're doing well, and they say it's going to be a majority in the popular vote and in the electoral vote for Alf Landon, the Republican. He's going to carry 31 states. Well, I don't want to spoil it for you, but they were a little off, okay? But it wasn't a foreordained conclusion. When Franklin Roosevelt takes power, assumes office in March, and it's March, not January, 1933, there's this amazing boom. The economy just shoots up like gangbusters, to use a 1930s term. And so from March until July, I'm not going to bore you with too many facts, but get these. Manufacturing is up 78%, Dow Jones 71, manufacturing production 78, durable goods production 199, auto production from 97,000 to 191,000 a month, daily steel production 33 tons to 116 tons. The manufacturing workforce goes up from 5 million to 6 million. The average work week from 32 hours to 42.9. Now that's a good day's work, but it goes down. There's a big dip after that from 1934. So the economy is up. People know they're not going to be out on the streets. There's going to be relief, a lot of federal jobs, a lot of just outright relief payments. Roosevelt had started this in New York around 1930. Actually, I think 1931. He was kind of late getting out of the box. It's I think only about $5 million. And he starts with something called TERA. And it's Temporary Emergency Relief Administration. Note that it's temporary. It's not meant that people are going to be on welfare forever or government payments forever. And hopefully the economy is going to recover. But it doesn't fully recover by 1936. You see a downturn up through 1934 where you see massive slippages in all of those categories, just about all of them. And so the public has to ask themselves, and Franklin Roosevelt has to depend on them getting the answer the right way, is the glass half full or half empty? Okay? And in 1935, in the run-up to around the time of the midterms in 1934, the Literary Digest asked the people, do you like the New Deal or not? And it's like 60-some%. And this is right about what they get in the midterms. The midterms are that's the first time in about 100 years where the party in power has not lost seats. The Democrats, even though having from 1932, are going to gain more seats in 1934. But in 1936, as 1936 is beginning, it's like that percentage is now down to a bare majority. A bare majority. And when you've got a bare majority of the popular vote, electoral college can, deliver the goods to the opposition candidate. And the Democrats are worried about that. Why are they worried? Well, they're worried about losing some key states. They're worried about losing Michigan. There's a fellow named Father Coughlin, who we'll get to later, who is, by 1936, vehemently opposed to Roosevelt. And there's a state called, begins with N and ends in K. It's New York. Franklin Roosevelt is worried about losing New York. Now, this sounds crazy. When he was reelected governor in 1930, he won by like 1 million votes. It was just this massive, massive landslide. Of course, in part, it's because the Republicans were split between prohibitionists and anti-prohibitionists. So those splits can be intriguing. Now, why is he worried? Well, in baseball, which I used to do, a fellow named Bill James said, there's a thing called the plexiglass principle. And if some guy has hit 190 or 203 his whole career, and then he shoots up to 305, the next year he might be back down to 220. So the Democrats have had such a good bump that maybe they're going to come down to earth in 1936. In 1932, with everyone voting Democratic and for the New Deal, the Republicans are still like 56% of the enrolled voters. Okay? They're still hanging on. There's a sort of cultural lag going on. In 1934, when the Republicans are getting schlumped again, they're still the majority party, 52%. And recall how much of that 48% is in the South, where it's all huge majorities. So the rest of the country is actually more Republican than 56 or 52%. It's only until 1936 where things are going to start to change. So the country is no longer quite singing, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" They're singing, more and more people are singing, "Happy days are here again." But it's based on a lot of people on relief. It's based on a lot of people in federal jobs like the WPA or the PWA, or in the original relief program under Harry Hopkins, which Roosevelt brought over from New York, FARA. TARA became FARA. All of these things had initials, the alphabet soup. And also what's going on with the alphabet soup in the run-up to the election is Roosevelt had two big programs aside from the construction programs, PWA and WPA, which were under the auspices of Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes. And they built amazing things, all the post offices and Triborough Bridge and tunnels and golf courses and dams, highways, apartment complexes, everything. But Roosevelt does not care for the dole. He wants people working. He wants things built. And when you have something built, it's almost like a billboard for your program. Okay, the work is not invisible. It's right there in front of you. So there are many, many good things going on there. But two of his other big programs are not quite as successful, not quite as wonderful as that, or the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, is the National Recovery Act, which is a micromanagement of business, both large and small, so that if you're a tailor in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and you are pressing pants, there's a code for pressing pants. It's a cartelization of industry. And they say, that guy can't press those pants for a quarter. He's got to charge 30 cents. And when he charges a quarter, the feds arrest him. And the Schechter brothers are selling chickens, live chickens in poultry in Brooklyn. And the code says the customer can't pick out the chicken she wants. And when that happens, the feds prosecute them. So the Schechter case goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, enough. It is unconstitutional, and it's gone. The second program which they knock out, which is massive, is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. In a time of scarcity, and this was a phrase you would hear over and over at the time to explain the Depression, and you can see probably on YouTube, where the humorist Robert Benchley is giving some pompous explanation of the Depression. And every fifth explanation he gives is overproduction, overproduction. So in the time of scarcity, in the time of want, the New Deal decides we're going to create more scarcity with the agricultural program. We're going to plow under cotton and wheat and corn, and we're going to slaughter pigs, and we're going to drive up farm prices. Now, this is good for the 25% of the people who are in farms, and they're still in agriculture at this point. It's not 3% like now. It's still a big voting bloc. But what's it do, like, if you're hanging around the cities or you're broke? Not good. So this is knocked out by the Supreme Court as well. So Roosevelt has some of his programs on the ropes at this time. And you're seeing opposition coming to him, well, obviously from the Republicans. That's what they do. But there's, the Republicans aren't exactly copacetic at this point. But on the right in the Democratic Party, there's a bunch of really millionaires from the DuPont family. And the DuPont family had so much money, they were funding and were in large part control of General Motors and a whole bunch of other things. And an associate of theirs had been the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a guy named John Jacob Raskob. and they are opposed to Roosevelt on the right within the Democratic Party. Now, John Jacob Raskob is not a household word nowadays, but we still remember the guy who he was very close to and who he gave a job at $50,000 a year in the middle of the Depression to manage a new office building that he had built called the Empire State Building, which was then known as the Empty State Building because there was a depression going on, but you know, Al was still cashing the checks. And he had had problems with Roosevelt's approach even before the election and ended up of 32 and ends up challenging him in the primaries and wanted to derail Roosevelt. They had been close, but there's no enemy quite like an old friend. And he's not in love with him anymore. So they are challenging him from the right. And Roosevelt is able to channel their opposition to a sort of PR bonanza because I'm running against those. They're the guys in the silk hats. I save their skin. They're so ungrateful, and they want to put you under economic oppression, you know, blah, 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 blah. So they are good targets politically. Other people targeting him are from the left, there's people on the, shall we say, Marxist left. The socialists under Norman Thomas are opposed to him. And the socialists are a factor because they had gotten like 800, 900,000 votes in 1932. And more to the point, they were centered in New York. So if they get like 400,000 votes for the mayoral race the year before or so, and if they get half of that, even half of that statewide in 1936, that could be trouble for the Democrats. Remember what I said about Roosevelt was worried about New York. So the socialists are opposed to him. Norman Thomas, he's pretty articulate. He gets some ink. The communists are technically opposed to him. They're running someone, except they're not opposed to him. Joe Stalin has said, I thought this Hitler guy wasn't going to amount to anything, but he seems to be trouble now, and we need all the friends we could get, so let's prop up this Roosevelt guy. So the communists run a candidate. They've also changed their kind of hardline stance. You know, you see that movie Ninotchka with Greta Garbo, and she's like some robotic type of spouting all these slogans, and anyone to the right of Stalin is bad, and you know, kill Trotsky. But then you have the United Front, and they come up with the slogan in the Communist Party USA: communism is 20th century Americanism. So all of a sudden they're all patriotic and all this, and they have run against Roosevelt, except they're not running against Roosevelt, because they know if they endorse him, that's the kiss of death. So they run, but they attack Landon, and a guy named William Randolph Hearst. Down the road, William Randolph Hearst, Hearst newspapers. And with the populist left is, however, more significant. And that's a whole bunch of guys. One of which is Huey Long, the senator from Louisiana, very radical. He has a Share Our Wealth program. Roosevelt there are certain things he wants to do from the get-go. You know, he wants the CCC. He's big on trees. Hyde Park was a tree farm, okay? He's always been conservationist. So it's like, go out there, chop some trees, build some dams, guys, get some fresh air. He loves that program. Eleanor doesn't. At one point she tells him, this program is worthless. It's not going to accomplish anything, Frank. And he's like, but the public loved it. Even the majority of Republicans loved the CCC. So pretty good program. he doesn't have to be pushed into the TVA either, because he and Al Smith had always run on public power. So these are his ideas, but other things he has to be pushed into. So when Huey Long has the Share Our Wealth program, the next thing you know, Roosevelt restructures his tax code, and it's soak the rich. You're paying over, you got over $1 million in income, bang, we're going to take most of it, okay? Or a bigger portion of it. So he's also reactive to a guy coming out of California, old sort of country doctor named Dr. Francis Townsend, who writes a letter to the editor, and it goes viral, as we say nowadays. And that letter says, well, we're going to give, or we should give, a pension of $200 a month, big bucks back then, to anyone over 65, on two conditions. One, they don't work. Okay, get out of the workforce, give it to some younger person, the job. And two, spend the money in 30 days. And that's going to create what they call a velocity of money, which other people would call priming the pump. Okay? So that's their idea of priming the pump. Now, how it's going to be funded is it's like a use tax. So every time, so you say you got a pencil, and so you get the wood for the pencil, and the government's going to get 2% of the wood making. And then you got the lead, and there's another 2%. And then you've got the eraser, and that's another 2%. And then maybe somebody sharpened it, and that's another 2%. And so that is going to lead to this massive, almost the equivalent of a sales tax and a very regressive tax on the whole program to fund it. Franklin Roosevelt hates this idea. He's also not crazy about doing a Social Security or old age pension plan right now. When Harry Hopkins gives a speech, I think in New York, and says, now is the time for old age pensions, which was in the Democratic platform of 1932, but not on the federal level. It's like the states are going to do this, and the states were doing this on a very modest level. It was growing. There were plans for state or federal matching funds, and so it was happening, but very slowly. And Roosevelt is going to, right after Hopkins, the day after, and from the same platform, after Hopkins says, we need to do old age pensions, he goes, no, this is not the time. But when the Townsend plan takes off and millions of people are signing up for it in these clubs, and when it is introduced into Congress, the House of Representatives, the very next day, Roosevelt introduces Social Security. And whereas the other programs were, who's going to pay for it? Roosevelt introduces that there'll be a deduction from the employer and from the worker. A few years later, someone says, you know, there's a lot of problems economically with this program, Mr. President. He goes, I think you're right, but I'll tell you, politically, the key is the contributions. And with those contributions, no one will ever be able to take that program away, because the people will have an economic, a fiduciary, moral right to Social Security, and you'll never be able to get rid of it. And he's right, basically. It's also very smart politically because it passes in August 1935, and they don't start taking the taxes out until January 1937 after the election. And they're not going to pay out because, you know, you got to get the money in first. I mean, you know, it's not like printing money like we do today. It's not going to pay out until 1942. But the Democrats take a bath in the midterms of 1938, and miraculously the payments start in January 1940 in time for the presidential election of 1940. So you've got Roosevelt now countering Long with a tax program, countering Townsend with Social Security. And then there's another big dog out there in the populist left who is Father Charles Coughlin. Father Coughlin was the radio priest out of suburban Detroit, Royal Oak, and I just remembered, today is the birthday of someone I lit a candle for at the shrine of the Little Flower in Little Fall, and Jewish. I like the irony of that. But I don't know how he felt about it. But he was originally a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt. By 1930, when Roosevelt is reelected here in New York for Roosevelt and thinks he's the second greatest thing since Jesus Christ. He doesn't like Hoover, he doesn't like Prohibition, he doesn't like divorce, he loves Roosevelt, and he thinks he's going to be tied into Roosevelt as an he's on the radio every Sunday to millions and millions of people. Roosevelt has this great facility of you meet with 15-minute blocks. I've seen his calendar. You can see his calendar online. And you come out and it's like, oh yeah, he agrees with me. We're pals. No. No. Huey Long has this same problem. Coughlin has this problem. There's another guy out there, remember what I said about agriculture and the AAA and scarcity, named William Lemke, Republican congressman. There were a lot of, what I guess we would call rhino Republicans back then, very progressive Republicans. He's one of them from North Dakota. He goes to Roosevelt in 1932 in Albany. They meet and he campaigns for Roosevelt. And he's going to be the big man in Roosevelt's agricultural policy. Well, he's not even a needle in a haystack by the time he gets done. He wanted to ramp up exports. And Roosevelt's policy is scarcity. Now, Huey Long cannot run for president in 1936 because he's shot dead in September 1935 in the state capitol in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His henchman, an orator named Gerald L.K. Smith. And Smith, by the way, is a minister. And Norman Thomas was a minister. And Father Coughlin was a priest. And there are all these people, religious ministers, that year dabbling in politics. It's sort of, and from all different perspectives. But where Smith teams up with Townsend and then brings Coughlin into the mix, and Coughlin brings in Lemke, and they form a third party. And this is another reason why what's going to happen with Franklin Roosevelt in 36, because now there's this party from the left of basically disaffected Democrats, except for Lemke. But Lemke had been part of the New Deal coalition in 32, who are going to pull votes off from Roosevelt. But William Lemke is not Huey Long. And the guys like Gerald L.K. Smith and Coughlin and even Townsend, this is the big ego crowd. And Franklin Roosevelt's been doing this political thing for a while, and he's been doing it 24/7 for a while, and he's good at it. These guys are amateurs, so they can't even get on the ballot in half the states. So they are, as things start, they might be a challenge, but then less and less. So what about the Republicans? We sort of ignored them. The reason they're impressive. They've candidates named Arthur Vandenberg. Vandenberg is significant in this story because he's the guy who pushed FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And this is what helped stabilize those banks in 1933 and put the money back in and fuel that original kind of boom for the New Deal. He was before that. Again, Franklin Roosevelt, no, don't want to do that. Not going there. And then when it passes, great program. They said it couldn't be done, great program, the naysayers, but, confidence is restored. It's like, okay. Another Republican running is Senator Bora, progressive, very maverick kind of guy from Idaho. And Herbert Hoover wants to get back in the White House. No. No, that kind of dies out fairly early. Which leaves Alf Landon, the Kansas Coolidge. He's called the Kansas Coolidge. He was the governor of Kansas. Off of winning for governor in 1932 in a three-way race. It was like 34, 33, 31. It was like really close. And then he gets reelected in 1940 when very few Republicans are getting reelected. Attention of William Randolph Hearst, who booms him in the press. Hearst papers, which are amazingly popular. Like 24% of the circulation of all the Sunday papers in America are Hearst papers at that point. And then he's magazines, Hearst magazines like Cosmopolitan and things like that. And they had, not to mention the newsreels. So there's really not that much to push against in the Republican Party. They nominate him. He's not the Kansas Coolidge. He balances the budget, but he hates the term. He hates the nickname because he says the Coolidges were all regular Republicans, conservatives, and my family were all progressives. So this is the triumph with an ashes in the mouth kind of triumph of the TR Progressive Bull Moose Party, because both Landon and his running mate Knox had been TR Republicans in 1912. And for that matter, and Bora, well, he never endorses anybody, but he was another progressive back from those days. So what if you're Alf Landon and you're running against this dynamo, Franklin Roosevelt, what are you going to do? How are you going to go about? Having gone to the convention, what does he do? He goes on vacation. He goes on vacation to Colorado to a very rich person's resort for 2 weeks, and then he plans to go on 2 more vacations. And start his campaign for weeks and weeks and weeks. And again, he's a very abysmal speaker. But again, what does Franklin Roosevelt do? Because the times are different. And we think of Roosevelt as being, sort of ubiquitous. He's the guy with the portrait on over every dining room table, and everyone loves him and all this. And he's on the radio with these fireside chats. And he's not as out there as you might think. He tells one of his pals, the public psychology, and for that matter, individual psychology, cannot, because of human weakness, be attuned for long periods of time to a constant repetition of the highest note on the scale. People tired of the same name day after day in the important headlines of the papers, and the same voice night after night on the radio. This translates into, from April 1935 to September 1936, there are no fireside chats. None. Right in the middle of the Depression. And he only gives one, not because, hey, it's September 1936, I got a campaign for president. It's because there's this massive hot spell in the United States. We remember the Dust Bowl before that. But then there's this crazy hot spell when Landon has the formal notification in Topeka. It's well over 100. It reaches 120 in North Dakota. And in New York City, the girders are starting to bend and melt on bridges and stuff. I mean, it's so bad that this is the first time in a presidential election where the opposite candidates meet. and they meet because Roosevelt goes west. He goes west, and he meets with 6 Midwestern governors. And actually, everybody likes each other. Everyone's pleasant. This Landon's a nice guy, you know, and the FDR is saying, if you get elected, get yourself a small yacht, because you got to get away from the White House. And don't get a big yacht, because then you'll have too many people on it. And then you can't get away from them. So everyone's nice at that point, personally. Roosevelt also has a later trip out west. And trip, he takes a guy named Tommy the Corcoran with him. He's the guy who wrote Rendezvous with Destiny. He wrote that line, okay? They didn't want to use it, actually, because the other speechwriter said, Tommy, who was a young guy, inexperienced, aren't people going to hear Rendezvous with Dentistry? Aren't they going to say Roosevelt's going to the dentist? Actually, I've looked at Roosevelt's schedule. He went to the dentist an incredible amount of times officially. I don't know if this was a cover for something, but he was like always going to the dentist, and which I can identify with this month. And so they also want to change it because they think if it's Rendezvous with Destiny, it might remind people of the poem by Pete Seeger's uncle, World War II, Rendezvous with Death. But they keep it in, and it's a hit. You never know what's gonna work. But Tommy is accompanying FDR on this train trip out west, and Franklin says, well, Tommy, did you learn anything on this trip? Well, I think I understand it, Mr. President, but I am puzzled because every guy who gets on the platform with you is thinking that he's going to end up as Undersecretary of Agriculture. And how are you going to get around that? Well, Tommy, that's one of the difficulties of being president. Yes, but how are you going to get around it? By giving the job to the person who I think will create the most trouble for me if I don't give it to him. So this is very cynical and practical out there. Enrolling, then he's a disaster. Because even though he can be bland, he can also put his foot in his mouth over and over again. So he gives a big speech up in Minnesota on free trade and the tariffs, alienates everybody. He gives a speech on agriculture, and it's like, we're going to cut spending and we're going to be more efficient, and you know, everything's going to go down in spending, but we're going to give the farmers this, and things they haven't even thought of. And people say, this is the most irresponsible speech we've ever heard. And then Milwaukee, and he talks about, he steps on the third rail of American politics, Social Security. Manages to alienate the conservatives who don't, and alienate everybody else who does like it. And the Republican Party issues statements like, you know, are going to have to Social Security, and that do we know that the government is actually going to pay this out? Because they've broken promises. They said they were going to pay stuff in gold. They're not. They cut off pensions to Spanish-American War veterans, and you know, the Social Security was supposed to be state-based. You know, can you really trust these guys? And the American people decided they could. This really helps to sink. Now, getting back to the polling, as on the new kid on the block, the scientific kid on the block is George Gallup. Still around today. Must be doing something right. Well, he's dead, but I mean his namesake. And July 12, he's got Landon ahead in the Electoral College. Okay? He gives a speech in Massachusetts and says this is going to be the closest race in in a century. And Charlie Michelson, who had been the hatchet man against Hoover for the Democrats in 1932, says Democrats are going to lose 100 seats. Emil Herja, who is the Democrat in-house scientific pollster and had done very well in 32, is worried from July or January on, reporting, states like New York and Michigan and key states are really wobbling, have problems with them. Working for the Democrats, with the ineffectual nature of the Republicans, it's looking better and better all the time. And then finally what happens is Roosevelt to New England, which had been traditionally Republican, southern New England, not the northern part, but he's drawing like 150,000 people at each stop. Eleanor is writing privately to her diaries or whatever, and saying, I was afraid people were going to be crushed. The enthusiasm is that great. Now, Roosevelt had always said, don't worry, we're going to pull this out. Other people might have been worried, and people were worried as late as September. They hold a meeting when Roosevelt, talk about vacations, after the convention goes off for 2 weeks on a little boat off the coast of Maine and New Brunswick, basically out of connection to the campaign. The bigwigs in the party are meeting at this point, and Eleanor sits in. Eleanor could be kind of iffy about where Franklin was politically and whether she cared if he won or not. There's some very famous and infamous statements by her on this. And it's like, she comes out of this meeting and says, this campaign is a mess. You guys better shape up. They shape up in part because of a donation of $476,000 from the United Mine Workers. I mean, this is a fabulous amount of money coming in from that amount. Originally, I think John L. Lewis wanted to give like $200,000 to Franklin Roosevelt. And you know how they come in with these big, they get a government grant, and they come in with a big check. Lewis wanted to do that. Franklin is like, thank you. But he knows this would be like bad PR, And so, thank you, but I'll just bother you if I need some small donations later on. And that's how it got to $476,000. So they're in shape financially. They're going after the black vote. Have Jesse Owens from the Olympics come in and campaign for Alf Landon. Owens was slighted by FDR when he comes back. There are black ministers who had connections to the White House who are saying, you ought to send at least a telegram or have the guy to the White House. He was big in Berlin. He won all those medals. Roosevelt, who is afraid doesn't seem to really care about social equality at all, keeps away from him. But the Democratic convention is very significant 2 ways. One, black delegates. First time ever. They got 22 alternates. Republicans had always had them. But this is a first for Democrats. So much of a first that a senator from South Carolina walks out, some guys with him. And because the Democrats eliminate the 2/3 rule. Before that, they could block, well, anyone could block, like a bare majority of the Democrats getting in. And what this led to was like John W. Davis being nominated on the 103rd ballot in 1924, or Woodrow Wilson, not till 44 ballots. You get these big deadlocks, or in New York's 1904, Alton B. Parker and like 40-some ballots nominated. So the party is going to shift at that point. And one of the things coming out of this shift reports in the press and on the Florida Convention like, is Franklin Roosevelt doing this because he wants a third term in 1940? And Jim Farley from New York, absurd, never going to happen. But it predicts that he's going to win. But he predicts like 360 electoral votes, and it's way short of, even some other predictions. The Republican Landon is only going to carry Maine and Vermont for 8 electoral votes. And Roosevelt was asked afterwards by the press, why did you underestimate so much of what you were going to do? And he says, well, that was my famous conservative streak. So he again, while he is this master politician, why he has carried people forward, remember when I said 1932 and 1934, the country is still officially Republican in terms of registration. That shifts. It shifts to where they're down to like 46% in 1936. Finally, this happens where the Democrats seize the hearts and minds of the American public. But you also see the black vote shifts to where it is like 71% of the goes Democratic, 71% of the black vote. This was a big shift because Herbert, he had carried only 3 in 1932. He had carried the rural Northeast, like northern New England, upstate New York, into Pennsylvania, a little bit into Ohio, and that's it. And then he had carried wealthier people, although there were a lot fewer of those back then. And then he had carried blacks. Now, he also carries the Catholic vote, 75%. He carries the Jewish vote, 90%. He carries like 102 of 104 big cities. And the whole, in carrying the Catholic vote and the Jewish vote, the immigrant vote, somebody had done a study around 1910 and said that, with the immigration we've had in the last 10 years, and which is keeping up, once their kids come of age, you're going to see a big shift electorally in this country. Bang! That's 6. There's a interesting. The Republicans, to show you how this was going on with the public and the voting, is that the Republican vote, even though they're winning all these elections from 1920 on, is totally flat, except for 1928 when Hoover crushes Smith. But otherwise, from 1920 to 1936, it's flat, okay? But the Democratic vote is going like this. All the new people are voting Democratic. Also, with the black vote, it's been observed that the older remained Republican in 36, but it was the younger people benefiting from the New Deal, and 40% of blacks were at that point either in government jobs, on some sort of work relief program, or on outright relief in 1936. And you can't beat St. Cross. I mean, that's a tough thing to get around for the Republicans. Conversely, the black vote, or the blacks are not covered by Social Security. Okay? Now, why is about 10% are covered? Still got 25% unemployment of blacks. You've got blacks on the federal payroll, they're not covered. And you've got blacks still down south in agriculture. and that's not covered. And then if you have an entity of 8 or fewer employees, they're not covered. This eliminates most of the domestic workers. All the maids and the valets and whatever, they're out. So you get very few of them covered. Roosevelt, of course, is bringing them in with her personal touch, and the money is there, but it is not going to translate into warmth from FDR at that point. Now, FDR over calculates. In 1938, the Supreme Court had abolished his 2 big programs. He's got a big majority. He's going to get revenge. He's going to pack the Supreme Court. No. And also the Labor Relations Act of Robert Wagner is going to create insecurity or upheavals in the labor market with strikes, sit-down strikes, disruptions. The economy goes into a second recession. Republicans outside the South get the majority of votes for the House of Representatives in 1938 after this big blowout. So Roosevelt goes from being the great genius in 36 to not such a genius in 38, but then you get the whole situation with the war, and it's a totally different story, which is not the scope of this book, but that's the end of the story here. So thank you. Now, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Roosevelt acknowledged the USSR in 1934, I believe.
I think as early as 33.
I mean, formal recognition.
Yeah.
And that made us the first nation in the world to acknowledge.
No, no. There were others. The Soviet Union and Weimar Germany had a lot of deals for armaments. We had trade relations with them, but I do know that the United Kingdom recognized the Soviet Union in the mid-20s, and then they found out that the, shall we say, seditious acts of the British Communist Party, that they were still, acting like communists. And they broke relations after that. So they had it and then they broke it. One of the conditions of Roosevelt recognizing the Soviets was that they would not be interfering in American politics. Like, they wouldn't be controlling the Communist Party USA. Nah. Well, they did. They would have these meetings in Moscow of the Comintern, and word would leak out where the direct control was happening. And this became a bit of an embarrassment to Roosevelt when, like, the Hearst papers and the Chicago Tribune would be reporting that. You'd sort of have to do a dance as to how much support you had from the Communist Party USA. Also, what happens is in 1933, one of Roosevelt's lesser known, we don't identify it with, the Export-Import Bank. And we want to increase exports and have people buy stuff from us, and then people will be working here. But the people abroad didn't have any money. So what do? We're going to lend them the money. We're going to lend the people in South America the money, and then we're going to also lend the Soviets money. One of the deals in this was that Moscow wanted to buy 50 commercial airliners from one of our big manufacturers. And the deal was going to be brokered by Elliott Roosevelt, who was going to get a commission of $500,000. But wait, there's more. Moscow didn't want 50 commercial airliners. They weren't building Aeroflot. They wanted to convert these things into bombers. Okay? And this is the time of American isolationism, where those DuPont guys were the merchants of death, where you were going to ban the export of armaments and weapons to foreign countries to prevent World War II. Well, that didn't work. But the Congress passed these things, and Roosevelt signed them, and this was the mentality. In 1936, Roosevelt, when he's on his way out west, he stops at Chautauqua, and he gives that talk. I have seen war. I hate war. So he's involved in this anti-war movement at the time, isolationist movement. There's a poll in 36 where if the American people are asked, Gallup poll, not literary digest, where would you, the American people would support going to war only if we were actually invaded or by vote of the American people, direct, plebiscite, okay, not Congress. So very, very anti-war. So the Nye Committee, which was investigating all these munitions, had the information about this deal for 2 years and sat on it, okay, by Elliott Roosevelt. And it's only until October 1936, just before the election, when an aviation magazine breaks the story. The Nye Committee says, nothing to see here, didn't go through. Hey, wait a minute, what about this $5,000 fee that Elliott did collect, which wasn't on his tax returns? The administration was very good at investigating Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, Hearst, Marion Davies, Huey Long, Al Capone, for that matter. That was Hoover. And actually Hoover started looking into Huey Long as well, but didn't go anywhere. It's like, again, nothing to see here, and the whole thing gets dropped. So that's a little bit of the Soviets in 35, 36. Yeah, you were up next, and then you. Okay.
Just remark your remark about FDR's appointment strategy certainly explains why Joseph Kennedy was the first head of the SEC.
Well, he was, there was, if you want to set a crook to catch a crook. But he was capable of causing trouble. A lot of people are writing. Boy, I go in the bookstores now, and I think all the current event books are crowding out all the history books. I think it might be my prejudice, but I think that all these, shall we say, polemical books, Trump is great, Trump is evil, this one, that one, it's like, it's all basically campaign documents, one side or the other. And so there's a lot of those books in 1936 and 35. Henry Wallace writes one, Ickes writes one, and so you don't miss the point of the book. Joe Kennedy's is, I'm for Roosevelt, exclamation point. And the most famous line in that is, I have no political ambitions for myself or for my family. But yeah, he had been a contributor, and he had been part of the sort of pro-business circle in 32, and I think had a role in writing Roosevelt's speech in Forbes Field, where he says, I'm going to slash all this spending, 25% down, we're not going to fund this, we're not going to fund that. It's really an incredibly conservative speech. He's quoting Coolidge, like admiringly, okay? So he has to go in 1936 and speak at Forbes Field again. And he calls in Sam Rosenman from New York, his big speechwriter, and says, Sam, how am I going to explain this? Roosevelt looks at the speech. So I have an idea, Mr. President. You have to deny you ever gave this speech. But Rosenman has a second idea, he has plan B. And the idea is not to deny it at all, but to put the spin on it, that yes, I spent, but I first had to get the economy, I had to get the budget balanced, for the American people first before I could balance the budget in Washington. So it's a very clever thing, but there's a sticky wicket for him on that. But Kennedy Sr., you know, has the SEC and he wants more, and eventually gets the ambassadorship to London. Yes?
Yeah, well, you know, I do know that most people with any interest in both that are often familiar with the four freedoms, but there was also the second four freedoms. And of course, I think he articulated these second four freedoms. I think it was only a month or two before he passed.
I think he did it on the battleship in the Atlantic.
Yeah, and to just finish, though, it seems like even though the second four freedoms were never actually attempted, domestically, to me, it seems like there was actually some effort to introduce the second four freedoms into the Marshall Plan and into Japan, and which tended to give these new struggling, rebuilding democracies much more of a much more healthier, robust social safety net. One that you could argue is still stronger than we currently have.
He might have, that might be one reason why he hung on in 44. You know, it's like, you could have had Felix the Cat running the country and still beat Hitler at 44 or 45. But maybe he wanted to, you know, rebuild the structure of the world. And of course the Depression in 29, 30 was a worldwide phenomenon, where you saw, I think in the first book, I talk about how you get these downturns in the economy from 29, it's just not October 29, and it's like some evil slinky going downstairs and taking you further and further downward, and with the credit Anstalt in Vienna, and tariffs and all that, so that there's a Hoover, you know, says it's a global economy, and the Democrats at that point are saying no, you know, it's you, it's not the globe. Don't blame the globe. But anyway, yes.
How much credit, if any, can we give him for ending the Depression, or is it all World War II? And can we say he saved capitalism?
Well, that's what he was saying. At one point, you know, there would be periodic meetings with bigwigs in the Hearst organization as to keep, you know, Hearst on board, or keep Roosevelt on board, or, you know, try to keep peace between them, which failed. And he's basically talking to this Hearst editor or official, and he's saying how he had to do all these things to save capitalism, and eventually, you know, they're not buying this at all. They says, so you're trying to beat communism with, and the Hearst guy interrupts and says, with neo-communism? and Roosevelt for once is like, doesn't have an answer, okay? And he had Vincent Astor there. Vincent Astor was saying, you know, you're gonna wreck me with your plans. And the Hearst guy brings it back to William Randolph Hearst and says, you know, at that point it's like Roosevelt didn't care. But does he say capitalism is one of the things about, I mean, capitalism and the free market had, you know, a bad reputation at that point, and the NRA goes into effect with big business backing, because there's a no great, they think that that the freedom of the market does not work. So does he save it? I mean, if there were crazy, as I say, there were crazier ideas out there. Oh, the NRA is another thing he does reactively. There was to Senator Hugo Black's wages and hours plan, which was to really ramp down, again, overproduction. So it's like people are going to work only so many hours, and if they don't, you can't export your goods across state lines. This is nuts. Okay. It's, yeah. I mean, it's like, no. And the business community supports the NRA. So did he save it or not? I don't think you can permanently kill capitalism. I mean, you can wound it a lot. Does he get us out of the Depression? This was the fact I forgot to say. In November 1936, the unemployment rate is still 13.9%. He spent all this money. He's got all these people on the government payroll. This is not what I would call a robust economy. And then you get into the war. The war really gets the economy, gets everyone working. But at what cost? The cost of millions of people in the service, the cost of people working, time and shifts and a half in defense plants, but not being able to buy anything. Okay? You couldn't buy a damn thing. You couldn't buy a tire. You couldn't get meat. You couldn't get nylon stockings. You couldn't get anything. There was just on Turner Classic Movies. It went off the other day where you can't call it up again. A movie called Rationing with Wallace Beery. Remember that one? This is a remarkable movie for in the middle of the war because it's really going at the bureaucracy. Not so much the shortages, but the bureaucracy of getting permission to buy anything. And that so many things were just not available then. So to call the wartime economy a recovery, no. Because people might have even had almost less in many cases, So, no, I wouldn't say it's getting us out of the Depression, but the safety net is built so that people are no longer so nervous about it.
So are you saying that even the war didn't end the Depression?
It gives you something else. I mean, if you still can't buy anything, you might be working, but you're not getting anything for it. Maybe you're saving the money up and then you could buy something after the war. But after the war, they thought there was going to be a big crash or depression, and it did not happen. I think because the government got out of the way. But there was inflation. There was inflation after the war. I don't think as much as during World War I, where food prices really went crazy. Yeah. But I think you.
Yeah, I got a photograph from my last trip to Hyde Park, a classic magazine cover about the 36 election. It's a Life magazine with a single woman sitting in the back seat of a convertible wearing a landing pin and the two coachmen driving her wearing Roosevelt pants in the front seat.
Yeah, I was just down there. I launched this book on the 13th, and they had a display about not about my elections, but about the 44 election and the blow-ups of Roosevelt just looked like death walked over. Just horrible. But they also had different artifacts too. They had like his crutches or braces, excuse me, and they had his hat, that beat up, crummy looking hat he had, which was his good luck hat. And they had his last pack of Camels. Okay, And they had a big blow-up color picture of him at Yalta, formal picture. Churchill is on one side, Uncle Joe is on the other side, and he's got a butt in between his fingers in the formal picture. There's a man with a smoking addiction, and it didn't do him good. But anyway, yeah, Hyde Park is great. You can get there. Yes, sir.
Another presidential historian that I'm really pleased to read her books is Doris Kearns Goodwin, No Ordinary Time.
Yeah, that's the story of the 1940 election, and in part how, Roosevelt has to dump Henry Wallace at that point, because he's been told by the politicos he's going to cost you 1 or 2 million votes, and that's how we end up with Harry Truman. But it's a great shift on his part from the isolationism. Well, he had been a Wilsonian and been in back of the League of Nations. Then, like in the 20s, he had been but he wasn't trumpeting it. But he had a plan, like, to get into the League of Nations, essentially with lodges reservations, okay, which Wilson would have rose from the grave and killed over that. And then to get Hearst's endorsement in 32, he completely goes against the League of Nations. But he's still somewhat he wants the World Court, which is not a particularly, he wants us to get into the World Court, which is not exactly some wild progressive idea, because William Howard Taft wanted us in, and Calvin Coolidge wanted us in. But it gets shot down in the Senate when Long and Bora and Coughlin go against it. And he writes to Henry Stimson, who had been Secretary of War under Taft and another internationalist Republican, saying these are dangerous, wild times, and people are listening to really wacko voices on the radio. But trust me, I know who our enemies are, and I will remember them. And it's an unusually frank admission from Roosevelt about how strongly he felt about that. But he also brings in Stimson, and for the war, Republican, as Secretary of War, and he brings in Frank Knox, who ran against him in 36 as a VP, as Secretary of the Navy. His idea in 36 was to realign the parties if he could. And even in 32, he had 3 Republicans in his cabinet. Wooden at Treasury, Dickey's, if he was a real Republican, at Interior, and Henry Wallace.
She was very good towards the end of the book, writing about his death and how everything came together with Mrs. Rutherford. It's an excellent book.
Oh yeah, and then Eleanor was not too happy about that, nor with Anna, who knew all about it. Anna was the daughter.
Exactly, she was the police and unit.
Yeah.
Rutherford.
Yeah. Anyway, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming.